Greetings, good morrow, and salutations, dearest viewer. Today I will talk about the downward mental spiral seen in Macbeth in the play Macbeth by Shakespeare. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth both have very interesting character development through the course of the story, but I'll only be focusing on Macbeth and how his brain was working during the play. The play begins with three witches giving Macbeth and Banquo is Macbeth's close friend, remember that, it'll be important later, and they tell them the prophecy they have of him, which is that he'll become King of Scotland, along with a few other things. But anyway, Macbeth sends a letter to his wife about all the things the witches told him, and his wife wants to immediately kill the king, in order to raise Macbeth's status. Lady, why is that your first thought? Fate said he'd be the king, let fate do its work. But this isn't about Lady Macbeth, this is about Macbeth, and he does not want to do that. Something called his ego began to talk. Ego is part of the Freudian theory of id, ego, and superego. Id is the part of your unconscious that controls your most primal desires, wants, and needs. It's a very selfish part of your mind. The ego is more rational, thinking about how to satiate the id's desire through more reasonable and socially acceptable means. And then there is the superego. This is our moral compass, the little voice in our head that tells us if an action is right or wrong ethically. When Macbeth heard about Lady Macbeth's plan, his superego was blaring. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, he tells himself during his mental back and forth about whether or not to kill the king. Which is actually a very good sign, as it shows his superego still has a say in his actions and thoughts, as well as how his mind is still healthy, unlike later on in the play. This monologue he has with himself, as well as his disagreement with his wife's plan, show his ego and superego are working and that he still has self-control. Macbeth knew that killing the king would not end well. Unfortunately, swayed by the promise of power and wealth, and maybe even his quiet desire to be the king, Lady Macbeth was able to convince him to follow through with the plan of killing Duncan. Now this is when Macbeth really starts to lose his marbles a little. After killing the king, Macbeth was hit with an anvil of guilt. I'm afraid to think what I have done. Methought I heard a voice cry. Still it cried, Macbeth shall sleep no more. Yeah, Macbeth was having this guilt manifest as auditory hallucinations. Now this is interesting, because although he killed the king, his morals are still intact. He still knows right from wrong. He's not a completely horrible person. He was just peer pressured by his wife to kill King Duncan. Similar to how other people in the real world are pressured into doing things they may not want to do. You may have seen this happen firsthand. People doing dangerous things because others prompted them to or pushed them to do so. Anyway, back to Macbeth. Because of this fresh wound on his conscience, his mental state was fragile and unstable. This leaves Macbeth more vulnerable to outside influence, which is exactly what Banquo was when he told Macbeth he suspected, "Thou playedst most foully to claim his role as king," meaning you cheated somehow to get your role as king. Anyway, this added paranoia on top of the guilt Macbeth already had to carry. This immense stress and fear led to him losing sleep, losing his reason, and maybe even losing his humanity. At this point, Macbeth is considering murder again. Again? You just killed the king yesterday. You're considering murder again? And it's not just a murder, but the murder of his friend, Banquo. That's a new low. And his motivation for doing it? To remove any risk of Banquo spreading the idea that Macbeth killed the king. Every minute of Banquo's being thrusts against my nearest of life. Macbeth hires murderers and instructs them to kill Banquo. Pause here. Take note that Macbeth isn't participating in the murder himself. He's hired others to do it. Not only does this detach himself from the murder, he also justifies his reason, saying that it was Banquo, in times past, which held you so under fortune. At this moment, Macbeth is participating in moral justification, saying that it's okay to kill Banquo because he's wronged you too. Rewriting his unethical actions as okay because it's for the right reasons, which is not true in reality. Another thing that people have done, viewing moral actions as morally right in their minds. Like how people justify their wrongs by saying, it's like a means to an ends. Now what I find interesting about this is that Macbeth has no actual basis of knowing whether or not Banquo knows of his crimes. He's acting purely off suspicion and speculation. But even then, that's not a good reason to kill a friend, right? To Macbeth it most certainly is. He's become desperate. He can't sleep, he can't relax, and paranoia gets worse. and he starts losing his rationality. His ego and superego are becoming quieter and quieter in his mind, leaving room for his id to take the stage. Macbeth is in full panic mode. His mind is in chaos and needs something to hang on to mentally. And the source of that stability? The three witches that gave him the prophecy in the beginning. The witches tell him something along the lines of, "Ooh, you won't ever be dethroned as king as long as the forest itself doesn't walk up and take over your castle." Now this itself isn't important. I just need you to know that this prophecy gave Macbeth some newfound confidence. And another important thing, symbolism is found during this scene when the witches show him Banquo and his descendants becoming king. Macbeth is thwarted by the son of Banquo. He refuses to look at him, similar to how he refuses to acknowledge the consequences of his actions, which is disregard of consequence, ignoring or refusing to accept the outcome of your actions. And one more thing, Macbeth has a new source of ambition, remaining the king, which is interesting because up until now, his only apparent motivation was to remove any evidence of his murder, but it also seems that he doesn't want Banquo to be king. To make him king, the seat of Banquo kings. Rather than so, come fate into the list and champion me to the utterance. Not only is this a strange change of motivation, but it also contradicts his earlier thinking about following his prophecy. Instead of letting fate happen and do its work, he wants to instead fight against it, also reflecting how his mind is beginning to reason less and less. Anyway, because of this promise of power until the trees themselves move, he begins to act like a frightened animal. What I mean by frightened animal is that Macbeth begins to act purely on instinct. The witch's promise gave him reassurance to be unafraid, but it seems he instead acts on every initial idea without a second thought, giving not the impression of a calm and confident ruler, but rather a crazed lunatic king. And what a king he has become, ordering the death of Banquo in private, and now ordering his army to murder his enemies and wife and kids. Yeah, it's not a very good look. And thus, Macbeth dies as a king, a tyrant, and a murderer. The play reveals how outside forces can affect one's actions, as it did with Macbeth. It reveals how Macbeth participated in various forms of moral disengagement to lighten the load in his conscience. It reveals how ultimately the guilt and paranoia carried by Macbeth ruined his mind, giving him a false sense of security, while in reality everything was crumbling down beneath him. This play may strangely reflect reality, and how people can be affected by the influences around them. It reflects the depth, complexity, and how the brain can twist your perception of reality. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Goodbye, adieu, and fare thee well.